Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com.
Hey now, today we're finally going to take a look at Fury of Dracula 2nd Edition from Fantasy Flight Games. Not to be confused with The Fury of Dracula, the 1st edition from Games Workshop. Yes, Games Workshop is so litigious they refuse to license the word "the" to Fantasy Flight Games. Okay, that's not true, but it would be pretty awesome if it was true. So I figured it was about time to hit on this. First off, because the game has been long out of print. I think at least 7 years since this printing came out. And Fantasy Flight Games is just about to print a 3rd edition of the game, revamped artwork. I hear some mechanisms are going to be changing, but it's mostly the same game. But it will finally be available again, which is the most important part. So I've had the game for a while. I figured now's the time to finally talk about it, because it was no fun talking about the game when nobody could actually get the game, or at least not for an exorbitant price. Also, I like the game a lot. I've wanted to talk about it. People have seen it on my shelf. I talk about it in Q&As. I talk about it in my top 10 list of top 10 one versus all games, where it was ranked number 2. So you knew that I liked it quite a bit. So my final thoughts for this won't be a total surprise, but it's worth giving it an overview and worth talking about why I like it so much. If you're not familiar with the game, it is a hidden movement game in the style of Letters from Whitechapel, Scotland Yard, Spectre Ops, and so on, where Dracula is gallivanting around Europe trying to evade his potential destroyers, the heroes of Bram Stoker's Dracula, like Mina Harker and Van Helsing and so on. They are trying to pinpoint and track down Dracula to destroy him once and for all. Meanwhile, Dracula is hiding his movements and leaving behind nasty encounters for them to run into. Before we go any further, let me give you a brief look at how the game is played. There's quite a bit to this game, so I'm not going to touch on every single little thing. I just want to give you a taste of what it's like. Then we're going to come back and I'll let you know what I think. Alright, I'm going to give you a very quick rundown of Fury of Dracula, the 2nd edition. This is a one versus all hidden movement game. One player takes the role of Dracula, and we'll get all of these Dracula goodies up here at the top of the table. But do notice that Dracula's miniature is not actually on the table. Instead, you're going to put it over on his track, all of which I'll explain in a moment. That's because Dracula is hiding. He is running around Europe trying to avoid the hunters. The hunters are every other player at the table from 1 to 4 other players. But however, do note that you will use every single hunter regardless of the number of players. So if you've only got a 2-player game, 1 player is Dracula, the other player takes control of all 4 hunters, and so on and so forth. Now, the goals of the game. If you are Dracula, your goal is to fill up this vampire track, or I should say, to move from 0 to 6 on the vampire track. As soon as you do that, you win the game immediately. There are 3 ways that you're going to do that. First and foremost, time is a factor. As Dracula, you are running around Europe trying to stall the hunters as much as possible. And that's represented by the constant shifting of the little sundial here by round. It starts off on dawn, but it'll eventually get around from small hours back around to dawn. And when that happens, Dracula is going to gain 1 up on the track, representing that time is running out for the hunters to stop him before he brings evil to all of Europe or something like that. The reason I have this token here is as a reminder, because one of the other ways that Dracula will move down this track is by maturing new vampires. I'll get to encounters in a few minutes, but encounters are these little tokens that Dracula can seed around on the location cards that he drops as he travels through Europe. If one of those is a mature vampire, one of 2 things is going to happen. Either the hunters stumble across it and kill it before it can mature, or it stays out long enough without the hunters finding it that it matures, which I'll explain in a minute, like I said. And if that happens, it's a brand new, fully fledged vampire that the heroes that Europe has to deal with. And in that case, thematically speaking, or mechanically speaking, Dracula gets to move up 2 spaces on the vampire track. The final way that Dracula can move up that track is by killing the hunters in one of 2 ways. Each of the hunters has hit points. For instance, this is Lord Godalming, and you see that down at the bottom of the card, he has a hit point track. He actually has the most hit points out of all the hunters. But no matter who the hunter is, if it ever gets down past 1 to 0, that hunter is dead, and Dracula gets to move 2 spaces up his vampire track. Now, every hunter can only take 2 bites Actually, Mina Harker can only take one bite because, as per the story, she has already been bitten. Notice how her bite mark section is already colored in, so she can only take one bite. But regardless of how it happens, if too many bites are issued to a hunter, they effectively die and become a vampire, and Dracula gets to move down the track for that as well. So, 3 different ways from which Dracula can meet his condition. The other condition of the game is for the hunters. If the hunters can kill Dracula, they win. They only have one way to win, is by killing him. They kill him by knocking out all of his blood tokens. He has these blood tokens here, 15 of them to be precise. If he is ever reduced down to 0 blood tokens, he is destroyed. The hunters have won the game. Now, Dracula can actually willingly spend those blood tokens for some of his special abilities, but he can never, kill himself by going to 0. Now, I'm going to try to just quickly go through the main mechanisms of the game because there is quite a bit to cover. The Dracula player is going to start off with everything that I have over here, which is quite a bit of stuff. The main onus of the game is actually on Dracula. He kind of has the most to do, or at least the most interesting stuff to do. Now, his movement is all hidden. So there are miniatures for all the characters. They're not that impressive, so I don't really feel the need to show them off on camera. Dracula's miniature never is on the board. Rather, you're going to put him on these location cards on the start of his location trail, which I'll explain in a moment, to show where he currently is. But also, if the hunters actually find him out on the map, you'll put his miniature out on whatever location he was found in, just to show that he has been found by the other players. But that's usually not going to happen. So let's go ahead and just explain the trail, because that's a major part of the game that so many other things pivot on. This deck of cards, for the most part, represents all the different areas of the game. You're supposed to keep them in numbered and therefore alphabetical order. So you see like the Adriatic Sea, the Atlantic Sea. These actually are all sea cards, and these are the only cards in this deck that have a different back. They all have a blue back, whereas all the rest of them have this sort of orange back or yellowish back. But then all the rest of these areas are different cities and countries and so on and so forth. So what this represents is Dracula's hidden movement. At the start of the game, the hunters all get to choose the locations that they start off in. You have all these different cities, spaces out on the board, along with travel routes and railroads and things like that. Once all of the hunters have made their decision, Dracula is going to purposely choose a location from that deck in secret. You do it under the table so the hunters can't see where in the deck you're pulling it out of, since they are in order, and puts it on to from his perspective, the leftmost side of the track, with his miniature there showing that he is there. So he is somewhere out there on the map. The hunters don't know. From then on, when it is Dracula's turn, he is going to move again. And when he moves, he chooses his new location, which, he has different modes of movement that he can use. Sometimes he can use special ability movement and such, but usually it's going to be to an adjacent territory. So, for instance, this card that I chose, mostly at random, is Prague. So, Dracula is currently in Prague. You can look out on the map and find Prague. Well, I don't know. I don't need to show you, but sure, why not? It is right there. So, there's Prague. So, this guy was not originally here. But now Dracula cannot travel via the railroad system. He can only travel by road or by sea. So if he wants to get around, he's going to have to go to, from here he can go to Nuremberg or Berlin, because there are roads connecting those. So, but again, remember, the heroes don't know this. So what he can do is, I'm just going to grab a random card, by the way, to speed things up. He'll decide to travel to Berlin, let's say, for example. So he will put his new location card down to the left track, pushing the other card down, showing that this is the older route that he was on. Next, after he's done moving, he gets to take an action, which, if there's a hunter in his space, then combat breaks out. I'll get to that in a minute. If not, he has to place an encounter down. Now, he has an entire token bag full of these encounters that he'll draw randomly. He'll actually have a hand, quote-unquote, of these 5 encounter tokens at the start of the game. And when he wants to put one down, he'll simply take it and put it on the card in the appropriate spot. This represents a random danger, well, random to the heroes, that the hunters will have to fight when they actually come to that location. When they get to a location that has an encounter that's still on the track, it will be flipped up, the card will be flipped up, the encounter will be revealed, and then the heroes are going to have to deal with it. But in the meantime, Dracula is going to keep taking his turns. He's going to keep moving cards down the track, and putting down encounters. And just to expedite this, it is entirely possible, and it will happen, that as the trail grows older, the cards are going to keep getting pushed down and down and down until they fall off the track. When they fall off the track, Dracula is able to take those cards back into hand, which means that eventually he'll be able to circle back and travel to those locations again. There's only one of each card, so he can't double back to a location until he gets the card back in hand. But it also means something else. Some of those encounter tokens actually have special effects when they fall off the track. Normally, when encounter tokens fall off the track, they're just gone, unless you choose to put them in the catacombs, which is where cards go when you don't want to get them back into hand, but you want to keep them out on the board with their encounters just to continue to stymie the heroes. That's entirely up to you. I mentioned there's a lot of stuff going on in this game. But I already mentioned that vampires, the new vampires you make, can mature and therefore get you closer to victory as Dracula. But there's other special effects that might happen when things mature as well. But let me show you some of the tokens and what they can do. You have tokens like, these are hard enough to see as it is. Let me try to focus it as much as I can. You have tokens like Fog, which makes it cities impenetrable where a hunter is stuck. It basically makes this thick fog that's going to blanket the area and keep things there. You have Rats, which are a nasty thing that the hunters are going to have to roll dice against to try to keep from losing health. Although Rats, amongst other things, can get chased away by special dog cards that the heroes may have. You have Assassins, which are really nasty minions that you're going to have to fight from Dracula, along with normal minions, which come in different types with different types of weapons. You have to look at the artwork. So this minion only has a blade, but there's other minions that have rifles as well. You have Spies, which are going to let you look at all of the event cards that the heroes are holding, or particular heroes. And then you have another example of one of the tokens that can mature, which is the Ambush, which can get really nasty for the hunters. Effectively, Dracula can immediately then play another one of his encounters on any hero on the board that's not in a safe spot. And that's most of what Dracula can do on his turn. Now, he does have some different special ability cards that you can make use of. In fact, one of the cards happens to be one of the location cards masquerading as or a power that's masquerading as a location card, and that's the Hide card. This looks like a normal location card that you put down on the track. That enables you to stay in the same location, whereas normally you have to continue to move. That's the only way you can do that, and remember, it would have to fall off for you to get it back into your deck. There are other special ability cards that you can use that will also go onto the location deck, so the players know that you have used them. So, for instance, you have Wolf Form, and notice the drop of blood there. That shows that you have to use your precious blood in order to activate these abilities. And you have Feed, which lets you drain one of the hunters. And you also have Double Back, which lets you, like it says, double back your locations. And Dark Call, which lets you summon minions to attack the hunters. But all of these things cost your precious blood and actions. Dracula also has a little mini-map that he can refer to so that the heroes can't tell where he's actually looking on the board, which could give away his location. He always keeps a black die next to him, which is what he uses for combat, and there's his hand of encounter tiles. He has two different combat decks. One of them is for minions. Whenever a minion has a certain weapon, he'll refer to that and use it for the combat. The other is his personal deck, which he'll use during combat. And I'll explain combat more in a moment. Like, he has his fangs, dodge, claws, escape, and mesmerize, strength, escape mist, escape bat, and so on. Now, Dracula's turn is always first in a round, and at the start of the round, if he's anywhere except on a C space where I guess time stands still, then he would move this track up once. And once he gets done moving and taking his actions for the turn, then it's the heroes' turns. And the heroes are always laid out clockwise from where Dracula is in a specific order. So Lord Godalming is always first, then you have Dr. Seward, and then it goes clockwise around to Van Helsing, and then Mina Harker. And they all have their own special abilities, different hit points. So all start off, and it's recommended you start off spread out across the map in order to pull in tight and like have a wide net to drag Dracula into a certain area and corner him. Now, the hunters can use different forms of movement. Dracula can only travel via roads and via ship. And actually, I should mention that if Dracula travels via ship, he actually has to give up blood because it weakens him being away from soil. But the hunters can move via ship and via road with no sort of penalty, and they are the only ones that can travel via rail. When they want to travel via rail, there are different rail systems out in Europe. The white ones represent modern systems, whereas the yellow rails represent old systems. When one of the hunters wants to take their move action to use rails, they have to roll the red die. And the red die will give you different results. If it's an X, you have a delay over your papers, which means that not only do you not get to travel, but you also lose your action for the turn. It really sucks. If you roll a 0, that just means you're not delayed, you just don't get to move, but you don't lose your action either. 1 or 2 means you just move over 1 or 2 railway connections. And then you have the 2 or 3, which means you have an express train, which means you can move 2 or 3 railroad connections, except you cannot do the old railway lines doing that because they don't have express trains. That is to say, you can move 2 rails if they're old rails, but you just won't be able to move the max of 3. Now, once the hunter gets done moving, he can take his action, which can take several different forms. But the first thing the hunter needs to do is tell Dracula where he stopped, which will allow Dracula to say, okay, that's one of the cards on my trail, meaning you're following my trail, and which will usually also mean that you have to face an encounter as well. It could also mean that you stumbled into Dracula and you have to fight him, which would be a bad case scenario, unless there's several of you in the same space. But normally, after that, you would just get to take one of your actions, which could be resting, which means if you rest, you gain back some of your hit points, but that can be a dangerous thing to do. There are event cards in the game. There's an event card deck. Now, the deck, when you draw cards, is always from the bottom of the deck. You always take the bottom card off the stack. The reason for that is because there are good cards for the hunters, which are represented by this cross, by the way, and there are bad cards which have this vampire symbol on them. Those represent cards for Dracula. If the hunters draw a card and it has their good symbol on it, they get to take that card into hand. If it is a bat symbol for Dracula, Dracula takes the card without the hunters looking at it, which means it's going to be some nasty thing that he's going to get to use against them. So with the rest action, the hunter gains back 2 health, but he also has to draw 2 cards, whatever that might mean. You can also do a resupply. The resupply depends on which type of area you are deciding to do the resupply in, whether it's a small city, a large city, and so on. So if it's a small city, they get to draw 1 event card. If it's a large city, they can draw an event card or an item card. If it's Castle Dracula, you get nothing, of course. That's Castle Dracula is only a good spot for Dracula. Dracula can go there, although the Castle Dracula card is double-sided, which means the hunters will immediately know that you're there, but Dracula gets to gain back blood just by being there. And then the last place that the hunters can go to is the Hospital of St. Joseph or Mary, which I'm, for some reason, struggling to find right this second. There it is. Sorry. It's actually pretty close to Castle Dracula. It is a holy place where Dracula cannot go. There's not even a card for that in his deck, and the hunters can actually get an event card and an item card by being there. So let me show you some of these cards that you might be gaining during the course of the game. I'll show you some of the hunter cards first and what they can do. This is an example of an ally. The hunters can only have 1 ally communally in play at a time. For instance, you have Jonathan Harker here, who says that while this card remains in play, the 6th card to Dracula's right in Dracula's trail is always revealed. You have Long Day, which you play this card at the start of your turn, move the day-night counter backwards along the track by 1. Mystic Resource lets you look at Dracula's event cards and share the information with the other hunters. and Vampire's Lair, a pretty complicated one. After Dracula has advanced his vampire track by at least one, then you may attempt to destroy one of the vampires that he has placed around Europe. Conduct a combat as though you are facing Dracula, but any wounds or kill results are dealt to that vampire instead. Then for Dracula, just to show you some examples of his, and there's many more cards in this, these are just examples. You have Vampiric Influence. Play this card on any bitten hunter. You may look at their event and item cards because you have some influence over them. Time Runs Short, which is an example of the Day Runs Long, which is you get to move the time track forward one. Unearthly Swiftness, you can play this card at the start of your turn to move twice in a row, following the same normal movement rules on the location track. And Evasion, you may immediately make an additional move. You may use this move to go to any city on the board. I call this, unfortunately, the Teleportation card. I'll talk more about that in my final thoughts. Now let's take a look at the combat cards that each player is going to get. Now there are a bunch of item cards in the item deck like Rifle, Knife, the Dogs I mentioned before, Sacred Bullets, the Heavenly Host, and things like that. But at the start of the game, the Hunters are unfortunately only going to start off with a punch, dodge, and escape, along with any other special abilities and items they may start off with their character. Whereas Dracula has all those other cards and special abilities that I mentioned before. But if combat should break out, which is going to happen when either one of the hunters stumbles across one of Dracula's minions, or when they actually find Dracula, whether there is multiple hunters in the same space or not, then combat will happen. When that happens, the Dracula player, whether it's one of his minions or not, and the hunter player or players involved are going to take one of their cards from their hand and place it down, and then they are going to roll a dice with any applicable modifiers, and there are several modifiers that may come into play, like for instance if the hunters are bitten, if there's special cards that the hunters and event cards that they've used already, and so on. They will each roll their die, and people like Lord Godalming can actually get to roll 2 die and take the highest, so there's a lot of different modifiers in this game. Then, once you flip over the cards, determine what's going on. These are both escapes, which was a bad example, I admit. But if it had been like a legit combat card, you would actually, whoever has the highest modified roll would look over on the right side of the card and see what result happens given what the opponent played. So, for instance, if you have the highest modified roll, and in this case with Strength, if my opponent had played a pistol card, then I would get to deal I would get to deal 1 wound in this case. If my opponent had tried to play an escape card, I actually get to deal 2 wounds. It's possible that sometimes the battle just continues, in which case you'll throw down one of these continue markers. But eventually it's going to get down to one side having to either be destroyed or escaping. Usually these battles are in favor of Dracula unless more than one person is ganging up on him. So the heroes probably want to escape. It's enough for them to know where Dracula was at that current time until help can come, where Dracula actively wants to kill the hunters, but sometimes may have to escape instead. And some of the special circumstances on the card, if he were to fail, would force him to be repelled and run away to fight another day. And that is most of Fury of Dracula. I could go on. All of the heroes have their own special abilities I can go into. There are special tokens like Sacred Ground and things like that. And, lots of different special abilities that can happen during combat, but it's a pretty involved game. I just wanted to give you a taste for what it's like and what you could possibly expect in the new 3rd edition as well when that's finally available, which is probably the edition you should get because this one's pretty hard to find. Now, let's get to my final thoughts. Now, I do want to make it clear, since I don't think I did so in my intro, I've never played the 1st edition of Fury of Dracula, The Fury of Dracula, and I have no desire to. I think that's a couple editions too far back, even if there are some things that are better, as one famous Dice Tower correspondent seems to claim. I don't think it'd be worth it. I think Fury of Dracula 2nd edition is great as it is, and hopefully there's nothing but good things coming with the changes for the 3rd edition. So, always looking forward, I would say. But it's still worth talking about this one, just to let you know how potentially awesome the 3rd edition could be. And most of that springs from one word, and that's theme. Now, it's not that I love Dracula that much. I'm not really into vampires, and I thought that the book was just okay. Obviously it's dated, hard to read, especially when you're forced to read it during high school. But I do think that this is one of the board games that is most true to its source material and brings that theme and storyline to life in a really epic way, a very entertaining way. It takes some liberties with the original story, but really the essential bullet points of Dracula hiding and just being this huge, powerful, malevolent force, just hanging over metaphorically and literally the heroes of the book, and also over all of Europe, and the terror that he inspires as he goes along. That's here in this game as he goes from area to area, dropping his minions and his spells and his ambushes and assassins, and transforming into these different creatures and summoning the minions of the night, the creatures of the night. All of these different things are in this game, and the heroes are trying to stop him, realizing that no single hero is going to be able to stand up to Dracula. You can't do that. Instead, you have to work together. You have to team up. You have to get him into a good position and go at him multiple people at a time. You have to outwit him. You have to outthink him. That is what this game brings forth. Those feelings that were also in the book, really, if I remember correctly. And it just does a fantastic job of that. And I have to tell you, and part of that is that it's not just that the theme is there, like it's exposition laden down onto the game components. It is tightly wound to the game mechanisms, and nowhere is that more present than with the location track, the trail that Dracula uses to move around, which is one of my favorite mechanisms ever in a game. I don't know why. It's just that, with other hidden movement games, there's pen and paper or pencil and paper, where it's just like, okay, I've made my movement. Okay, it works, it's there, it's fine. It's in some games that I really enjoy, like Spectre Ops, but that's not all that interesting or exciting. It's just like a workhorse type thing you have to do. Fury of Dracula found a way to make it super fun and interesting. Putting down that trail of cards, having that like breadcrumb trail where the heroes can play action cards to actually look at some of those cards and then follow the trail. That in and of itself is interesting. But the fact that Dracula can throw encounters out on those cards and be like, ooh, ha, ha. So you're seeding these different elements down there, and it could be any number of nasty things. It could be cards that he wants to mature, so he puts them in faraway places in hopes that they, like the vampires, will mature and get him one step closer to victory. And that's very interesting. That's also super tense for the heroes. Like, all right, we need to find these vampires that he's undoubtedly putting down on the board somewhere, but those are also potentially super deadly creatures that we have to fight. And do we go and deal with all these little crises that Dracula is dropping around the board, or do we go for Dracula himself, who is our ultimate goal? How do we do that? So, again, it's the tension of the theme together with these game mechanisms. And there's so many little things like that in the game. How you move, where you can move via railroad, and some of them are old railroad tracks. And how you can move via sea, which for Dracula is very telling, because the heroes can see when Dracula is going from port to port because of the way that his location cards are. I didn't even talk about the fact that Dracula has special cards that he can use in place of his location cards. He could also hide in a certain place with one of his cards, which is super cool and interesting, and another little interesting bit to throw in there. And I do think that the game is most fun when you are Dracula, for sure. In fact, if I was going to say there's a criticism about the game, a couple criticisms, but one of them is the game is probably way too unbalanced in favor of Dracula. Unless you have a really seasoned group of players who are used to all of his tricks and stuff. The first time you play with someone, unless you tell them every single thing that Dracula can do right off the bat, Dracula's going to win. Because he just has trick after trick after trick to use, all of his special abilities, all of his special cards, so on and so forth. Whereas the heroes only have so much stuff. They really have to work together. And I find the whole aspect of the event deck that they draw from, which is mostly hero cards, but has some of the Dracula cards. You want to draw from that deck if you're a hero. You really do. You need those cards, but you're potentially filling Dracula's hand with more negative stuff that he's going to use back against you. So it's very harrowing for the heroes. Not to mention that you do have some really cool abilities to use against them. I would say one of the weakest parts of the game as far as the mechanisms is the combat, which is just a little bit too fiddly, and I think it's one of the things that needs to be streamlined with the new edition. Although I can't think of another way that it could have really been done. I don't know. Card combat was the way to go, but it felt very clunky to me. As thematic as some of the elements are, being able to use garlic and consecrated grounds and things like that, and Dracula's minions have their own little set of cards. Okay, that's fine enough, but I think a lot of that stuff could have been simplified really, especially when it comes to the encounters that Dracula puts down onto the board. Also, the whole aspect with the vampires, one of the most interesting parts of the game, but that's also something that I think tips to favor back in Dracula's favor. I didn't say that right, but but it is another way for Dracula to win other than just waiting out the clock, which can be really difficult for him. So there are some balance things that could be probably worked on, but some of the ways that the game balances out are pretty interesting. I mean, again, you've got 4 heroes against one guy, and the map is smaller than you would think when you have all the miniatures out there. So Dracula needs every single asset he can have in his favor in order to escape. I will say, though, a couple of the cards that he gets, like I call them the teleportation cards, that just say, okay, move to any other city along the seaboard or wherever it is, too powerful. That can completely ruin tons of work that the heroes are doing and throw everything off and essentially lose them the game if that comes out at the wrong time. I've heard some groups take that card out, and I've heard some people just say, forget it, you leave it in. That's how strong Dracula is supposed to be. I'm on the fence about it. I always leave it in, but maybe they'll do a workaround for that in the new edition to keep things more balanced, at least in that regard. But man, there's so many things I didn't even touch on in this game, but it is super great and super cool. The whole aspect of the resolve of the heroes as the days go by, it's easier. It gets Dracula's closer to victory, but the heroes now have more resolve to spend on special abilities. I could go on, but listen. This is a solid game, and I'm so excited that a new edition is coming out to share with more people. The problems of it is just that it's a little bit unbalanced, and it also is a little bit too long. It really is. I mean, the game, that's why I think a lot of things need to be streamlined, just to keep that length under like 3 to 4 hours, which this game could easily go up to if you're playing with people who are not familiar with the game. It could go on a bit too long during the heroes phase, because Dracula is just throwing down a card. It's not too tough, but the heroes have to be like, you should go here, blah, 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 blah. Alpha gamer syndrome can be a problem with this game as well. I mean, the game has to be played with 4 heroes. It doesn't matter if you're playing with 2 people or 5 people. So right then and there, that's a red flag for alpha gamer potential. But if you're playing with the right group, people who are familiar with the game, people who are into the theme and can really get into it, and you have a good Dracula who really relishes the role, just has fun with it. That's me, by the way. I always insist on playing Dracula. This is a blast of a game and one of the most richly thematic experiences I've had in board gaming. Can't wait for the new edition and to share it with all of you. That is Fury of Dracula 2nd Edition from Fantasy Flight Games. Wait for the new one. Don't try to hunt this one down, but check it out when you can.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.